Check 1, 2. Check, check. Good. We'll go ahead and get started. If you happen to hear fans in the back, we had...
Like cheering fans?
You won't ever hear that. If you hear blowing fans, we had about 3-4 inches of water in the sacristy, so we are airing it out. Thanks to Bill, him and Kevin came and vacuumed it all out for about 6 hours and saved our back end. So figuratively and literally our back end. So exactly. You can come through. You're fine. You don't got to walk around. All right, let's open with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for this evening, and we thank you for the chance to talk about what often end up being confrontational and difficult topics in our culture, and specifically within the culture of the church. God, we ask that you would give us wisdom and clarity and awakening in new insights. And more than anything, God, we ask that you would help us to fall more in love with you and more in love with our neighbors and more in love with who you've created us to be. We pray this in your name. Amen. And my app is reconnecting, so give me 1 second here. Here we go. Wi-Fi is not available. That could be a big problem. Let's see. Wi-Fi. Private.
Quick question. Do you
Yeah.
have a hat for each night?
I have hats and shoes that could carry us for a very long time. Does anybody remember the password to the private? Let me text. It's not very private. Generally, people know it.
I think it's 399 Wicket.
It's close to that. I think it's our phone number. Call Michael Basil. Call Michael Basil. Well, the problem is it's got to be on what that is or it won't pair. Otherwise, I wouldn't care if it was private or not. What's the private password?
Let me put you on speakerphone.
The iPad isn't pairing anymore. It was. It's capital grace, which we all need. It's good. So tonight we're going to be talking about gender, homosexuality, LGBTQ, all of that variety of stuff. We're going to do the super cursory glance because to get into the depth of all of this would take much more than an hour and a half. But what I want to focus on, specifically within the LGBTQ side of stuff, are the 6 or 7, depending on how you frame the scriptures, the 6 or 7 scriptures that are used and held as reasons why the church or people of faith should be not anti-LGBTQ, but why not affirming of that sexuality as a good place to be within the church. And I'm going to try to give you multiple positions in the midst of this. I will do less well this week than I have previously. And the reason being is because I think at least 3 of them are really stupid. I mean that in a like really unintellectual in how they're treating the Bible, and we wouldn't allow that to be treated in that way in any other frame. And so for me to even present those trivializes the depth of this conversation and how it affects people within our world and in our community. And so I just am going to avoid those. If you want to talk about those, you're welcome to. So there's 2 books that I would recommend. And I have copies of that you can take if you promise to read them. And then I don't want them back. I just want you to give them to somebody else. One of them is by a dear friend, Colby Martin, who's a pastor in San Diego now. He came from a very similar background that I did. He grew up Southern Baptist, was a Southern Baptist kind of church planter, originally a musician, then became a pastor, was fired from his church because he had a shift in his belief about LGBTQ affirmation, and was fired on Facebook by his church, which was crazy because just because he supported 2 gay friends that were a part of their church. He's straight, not that that matters, but he's a straight dad of 4 kids and lovely wife, both are pastors. And so this is his journey from where he was to becoming an affirming pastor. And it tells his story of losing his job, so it's kind of a mix of a spiritual autobiography then into how we treat these 6 scriptures. So it's called Unclobber. The reason it's called Unclobber is because those passages are frequently referred to as the clobber passages, the ones that kind of knock you on the head. And then the second one, thank you, sir. Beautiful. The second one is by David Gushee called Changing Our Minds. I think last week somebody asked the question about just war theory, and I talked about Glenn Stassen. Glenn Stassen he died a couple years ago, was the primary theological ethics professor at Fuller. And him and Dave Gushee have probably my favorite overall ethics book, Christian ethics book, called The Kingdom of God. And Dave's taught all over, everywhere, was a hardcore evangelical, still is a hardcore evangelical, teaches at evangelical seminaries, but had this transition of how he understood the scriptures, and it caused him some grief as well within that tradition. But this is his book called Changing Our Mind, and it just walks through the kind of scriptural interpretation and shifting and what we know about different things psychologically and all that. And it's a great book. So these are 2 that I would recommend if you're wanting to dive deeper into this conversation. They're there. But before we jump into all of that, I think it is helpful to talk for a second about the Bible as a weapon. So in theological circles, frequently we talk about the weaponization of the scriptures, how they're used. Like one of the places where you would see this is in spousal abuse, or in divorce, or in genocides like we talked about last week, or in these moments where people take sections or scriptures and then they use them really as a weapon to kind of put an end to conversation, or to kind of obliterate a person or a group or a people. And that generally, as a practice, is not helpful. So kind of as a framing device for us, I would say this: if the text at any point causes you to hate, you're reading it wrong. and you need to read it again, go deeper, look for other interpretations, look for other ways to engage, right? We talked about, like, there are multiple ways when we talked about principles of interpretation, right? We talked about there are these different ways that we can come at the text, and if your interpretation is leading you to hate a group or a person or permitting you to remain in your hate, you need to read it again and ask some different questions. So that's number one. I would say that's, as a rule, know that. Secondly, I want to implant within us, if it's not already there, that differing is biblical. Right? Having different opinions about the same thing happens over and over and over in the Bible. An example of that would be monarchy, right? You have certain texts written by certain writers in the sacred text where they're very pro-monarchy. And you have certain texts that are very anti-monarchy. That is in the Bible, I believe, things like that, those differing moments, to remind us that within the tradition that we come, from the Judeo-Christian tradition which we come, it was very normal for there to be different stances. So think about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. They were all a part of the ruling body that eventually crucifies Jesus, but they differed. One group believed in that there was an afterlife, one didn't. One believed in the Spirit, one didn't. And that was a part of the makeup of who ruled the religious frame at the time. So for our brothers and sisters who came before us, this idea that we all have to see exactly the same and come out on the same end of things is new in a historical narrative, right? It's not something that we've always held. So if we come to different places, I want to say that's great, right? Now, if your place is allowing you to hate, go back to point one. If my place is allowing me to hate, go back to point one. But if we are living faithful lives following the way of Jesus and hold different realities, I think we should celebrate that and talk about that more, because it's part of the beauty of who God is in the midst of us. Third, I think we need to learn how to differ graciously. I think that's something that has really gotten lost, specifically since the permeation of social media. I would say the church has never been good at differing graciously. We usually kill people that are different than us in the old days. Now we just write bad things about them on Facebook. So if I had to choose, I would choose the Facebook piece. But I think it is very okay for when you're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and your brother or your crazy Uncle Sal pulls out this like nuclear bomb of a statement that's just trying to get people to get a rise, for that to be dropped and you simply to say, wow, I believe very differently than that. Now, I do think it is important for people of faith, when we differ, to say, I believe very differently than that. And the reason it's important is because often silence tells people you agree with them. And that's not healthy either, right? So saying, I believe very differently than that. When they say to you, well, what do you believe? I think it's okay to say, you know what? It's really not important, but I just need you to know that I believe differently than that. Because part of what we do in those moments are we bait each other for a rise and then to start this whole thing. And what we know about brain science is that our brain is built to have people agree with us, right? So we'll cut out information that's different than we believe simply because that's how our brain is wired, and you have to work against that in order to shift it. And that's not generally going to happen in one of these kind of conversations that we're talking about. That happens over years in relationship with somebody. So I think it's completely good just to say, wow, I see that completely differently. And just let it be and differ graciously. I think that's a good thing. And then the final piece of this kind of Bible as a weapon, part of what allows us to use the Bible as a weapon is what we often refer to as proof texting. You've heard this before, where somebody just pulls out a single verse, they drop the bomb on it, and then that becomes the thing. I think proof texting on any side is generally unhelpful and tends to weaponize the text. Because when you take the whole book of that passage, or the whole library of books that equal our Bible, and start drawing, narrative lenses that go through them all, and start finding how all these things connect, and what is the meta-narrative, like if we were using literary critique, like what's the meta-narrative happening here? What are the overall pieces that this is leading to? What did the people who built this canon, not weapon canon, but collection, what are people who built this collection of texts trying to lead us to understand about God and ourselves and our neighbor and that sort of thing? That's a much more healthy way, and it often prohibits us, because it is so varied, from coming into this weaponized frame. Fair enough? Any questions about that before I jump in, or statements? Sorry, I'm not taking off my shirt to show my shirt, although I'm about to get into this. I'm taking off my shirt because it's really hot in here. So the next piece before we start is bias. Bias in modernity has shifted from the conversation of bias in postmodernity, from an academic standpoint. And the reason being, this is a very oversimplification, but the reason being was, in modernity, we believed that we could do work on a scientific frame without bringing any bias to the table. And it was part of how we wrote, like when I started writing papers, theological papers, the idea is, take you out of it and get the truest sense of what is. Part of what postmodernity and postmodern critique says is that's not possible. No matter how much you want to take you out, you can't. So, in postmodern paper writing and critique, part of what you do in the very first part is you name your bias, so that you're putting it out there and you're being very upfront about, this is how and why I stand where I stand, and this is a part of it. And so naming it is important. So clearly, I'm wearing an Erase Hate shirt, and I have a bias on this topic. More than any of the other topics that we have, I care about this topic more. For personal reasons. My son's godmoms are a lesbian couple, and our aunts, they are two of the most faithful human beings in the world that I know, both to Jesus and to transitioning and transforming the world in the way of Jesus. In fact, when we were choosing godparents for my son, that was before we knew we were going to have a second, and that the whole choice was about who would we most want our kids to become like. And it was Lori and Brooke. My movement in evangelical fundamentalism, out of evangelical fundamentalism, had a lot to do with this topic. Partially because in my youth group of 200 plus teenagers, that high school was right across the street from our church in Boston. And we got one gay kid, and that gay kid was welcomed, and Adam was an amazing kid. And then once the community within the school realized that we were a safe space, we've had like 30, 40 kids who were self-identified as LGBTQ in one form or another, who found their home in our congregation. And it was a transformative life experience for me. Prior to that, I don't know that I had had any real relationships with people who were LGBTQ that I knew were LGBTQ. And I could tell you story after story after story about how that was a shift for me on how I saw the Bible, how I trying to make sense, trying to understand all this stuff. But that's a big piece. So I wear the shirt to reveal my bias in this moment. And I want to acknowledge that for all of you. So if you're in a different place in that, totally respect that. I see that differently than you. So we'll practice what we preach in this. So when we start talking about sex and sexuality and gender and all of that, even before we even come to the conversation of LGBTQ, I think it is really essential to name some of the messes of the Bible, like the fact that it's written by all men, right? And for a very long time in human history, the only people who had power were men, and they could kind of sleep with and do with anything they wanted. Everything else was chattel, including women. And so when we come to the text, that's part of it. That's part of the mess. So Brian McLaren tells the story of the first time he heard a woman preach, and she was preaching on the text of when the prophet came to David and told him that he had lived in sin, and David says to God, I have sinned against you only. And he said that one of the things she did from the pulpit was she said, I just want to be honest and say, no, he didn't. David sinned against everybody. He sinned against Bathsheba. He virtually raped her because he had power over her. We would consider that rape in today's culture without question. He sinned against his community that he was supposed to be leading. He was a failure of a leader. He sinned against Bathsheba's husband, and to the point of murdering him. And she named all of these things. And Brian talks about that in that moment, having a female preacher name this for him was the first moment that he realized he could be in contradiction with Scripture. And that's a powerful frame that our female counterparts, that our LGBTQ counterparts, that our African American and Latino counterparts, that all people who are other than white evangelical persons, males, bring to us in this conversation of biblical critique, right? It really matters. And so naming that, okay, this is written from a very misogynistic framework in a world that, like, it was middle of the 19th century before the word homosexuality ever was used in any form of literature, right? So any text that we're reading as translated as homosexuality, that word just, it wasn't, like, if you go back prior to 1945, you're going to be really hard-pressed to find any Bible that uses that word in the Timothy text that we'll talk about tonight and the Corinthians text that we'll talk about, the Ephesians text we'll talk about tonight, because it just wasn't a word. Like, the concept was there, but the word framing that wasn't. So then you have this whole, okay, what do we do with that? Like, what do we do with, we're trying to have a conversation with the Bible about a thing that most of the time it was written in didn't have the same construct, and it definitely didn't have the construct with which we hold homosexuality today, right? Of a, like, homosexual, like Aunt Brooke and Aunt Lori, it didn't have the same, there were no monogamous, committed, married realities of homosexual relationship up to this point. So that's a messy reality when we start talking about this as well. So, funny things like this come up, right? Like, if you want to know about what's good marriage in the Bible, it's not probably the best place to look. It's messy, right? You could marry, you can't read all this, but I'll put a post-it for us. Like, you could marry a man and a woman. You could marry a man and a woman and the woman's slave. You could marry a man and a woman and a concubine. You had all these different realities, relationships. You could have 3 wives. You could have polygamy. That was a thing that was allowed in the scriptures. You could have a marriage of, your brother-in-law because your brother had died. In fact, that was affirmed. That's the book of Ruth, right? Or that's the idea of the book of Ruth, not the book of Ruth itself, but that you had this kinsman redeemer, which we later use and call Christ the kinsman redeemer, which is taking it out of this frame of relationship. You can, all of these realities of marriage that are affirmed in the Bible. So even our affirmation that we engage in one man, one wife frame is messy when you take it back to the text. Now, part of the reality of this is just the nuancing, right? I'm not trying to make things difficult for you. I'm not trying to, I don't even actually care if I persuade you, to be honest with you. I'm just trying to show you that it's messy. It's not as simple and clean as we want to say, well, it's Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. Well, in some places it was Adam and Eve and Susie, and Adam and Eve and Susie and Sharon. And, this is because women didn't matter. And I can't pretend like they did in the text. Now, that's a blanket statement. Did women matter? Of course women matter. You have these great stories of people like Ruth and Esther, and I can pull these moments, even if you were with us last Christmas, we did the mothers of Jesus, and part of why we did that is so you could see even in the lineages that are written, there's purpose of including these women who were often considered outsiders to tell us differently from the frame of the day that women matter more within this tradition than we're often communicated.
I went to a church for a while where the pastor talked about that one of the most compelling arguments for the resurrection story being true is that women are the ones who first come upon the empty grave. And since they didn't mean anything in their society,
why would you include that? Right. I'm going to repeat that for the camera because I've gotten in trouble again this week. So what she said was that she was at a church where the pastor was preaching on that part of the beauty of the resurrection is it's the women who find Jesus isn't at the tomb. And it's part of the contradictory nature of the scriptures is that we value this part of the story when many realities would not have valued the fact that the women were the first to see. Right? Again, there are these beautiful nuggets, but when you take it as a whole, it comes across as pretty misogynistic as a frame of a sacred text. And a lot of the sacred texts, not just in our tradition, but in other traditions, are just really messy, right? And that's part of being honest and engaging in a way that is useful. And then you see memes like this, right, that I just think are important, right? There are 7 verses that are sometimes used to say homosexuality is a sin. That's, in case you're not sure, 7 verses out of 31,000. So from a mere statistics game, if you're a math person, that's fascinating. Now, I will also say, starting to pull 6 and calling them passages, when this was all written, there weren't numbers in your Bible, right? The idea of verses is so that we can use it in church and use it in study together. When you read the book, when you read it originally or when you go pick up a Hebrew scroll, it's not like there are little numbers beside every piece. It's just a continual text. So there are also 12 verses against divorce and 4 against having sex with somebody who is menstruating. And there are 2,350 verses about money, 300 about social justice and the poor, and 24 about immigration. So if you're just trying to play a rating game of what matters more within the amount of space that's given in the text, you already have a problem, right? That needs to be a part of the conversation. I would argue, first and foremost, that this matters because people's humanity is being declined them, but it doesn't matter as the conversation in the church in the way that we've made it the conversation in the church. We've made 4 political issues become the primary thing with which we engage or don't engage when there's so much more about what it means to love each other and to follow the way of Jesus that has nothing to do with those four conversations. So, doesn't mean it's not important. It just is what it is. So for the past 2 decades, the Pew Research Center has reported that one of the most enduring ethical issues across Christian tradition is sexual diversity. And when we talk about sexual diversity, we're talking about the difference between men and women. We're talking about the difference, the LGBTQ realities. We're talking about all the places where sexual identity and all of that play into the conversation. These have been the hot button issues of the church. You know, like, the ELCA has only been ordaining women since like 1976. That's messy. We have churches in our community who still don't value the women's voice. It's messy. So I would argue that it's pretty unlikely that biblical authors had any notion of sexual orientation. For example, the term homosexuality, as I said, wasn't even coined until the late 19th century. For many people of faith, the Bible looked to the Bible was looked to for timeless guidance on what it means to honor God with our lives, and this definitely included sexuality. In fact, like, there's great historical conversation about human sexuality that comes from Song of Solomon. So much so that when they were creating canons of the text, many people didn't include Song of Solomon, even though it was in the Septuagint, because they thought it was erotic poetry. And it is, by the way, in case you were curious. It's not this like just simple comparison of God to the person we love. This is eros love being lived out in the pages of the sacred text. But I think before we can jump into how it is that Christians can maintain any form of authority of the Bible and yet still affirm sexual diversity, I think it's helpful that we start with kind of a brief, clear overview of the assumptions many Christians approach in understanding the Bible, right? So kind of going back to some of the things that we've said before, that we recognize that there's different views of inspiration. And so if I am coming to the text as literal, I'm going to have a different output if I'm coming to the text as myth, right? And for those who are myth people in the room, myth is not lesser, right? Myth can often be more valuable than that which is fact. Anybody read Aesop's Fables growing up? It was one of my favorite things to read before bed, was because they were short and I could read one or two of them, and then this moral lesson, and that wasn't fact, it was this myth, this story of truths that it was teaching me as a kid. Or people who are coming at the text as historical. So what is this saying, and being different than literal in terms of the historical being like, what's happening in this historical moment? What are they trying to speak to? What are the questions of that day? What is it actually answering versus it just being like, this is the literal truth for me to then plug into my existence? So thinking back to these frames of interpretation that we did a few weeks back, if I can find them again, will help us see how we're going to come to different places. That's part of this conversation. Again, I know I keep coming back here, but I keep coming back here because it is the thing that changes everything. It is the thing that will determine how you feel about women, and especially if you're not reading it as a whole. Like, I'm really hard-pressed to understand what people do with Paul if they don't believe women have a place of leadership in the church. Because Paul continually brings out women who are furthering the mission that if they weren't there, we wouldn't have had any missionary journeys. And so I don't know what we do with that, but somehow people can read through that without seeing that. And I think that's part of the conversation piece. So within the frame specifically, I'm going to jump now into this idea of LGBTQ. When I say that, in case you don't know what that means, lesbian, gay, bi, transgender, queer, now it's QIA, intersex, ally, now there's plus, there's a whole bunch of new letters, and I'm not going to play there because it's the same reality, similar reality for each of these in this conversation. So there are 6, some people say 7, texts within the Bible that this frame is supported on. The first one, I'm going to say 7 tonight simply because I think there's one that kind of is the starting point for everyone, and then it goes from there, and that is Genesis 1. So, does that go? Yeah. So in Genesis 1, part of what we see is what's been framed the natural law argument. If anybody grew up Catholic, this is the frame of Catholicism. That in Catholicism, in nature, it is normal for things to be homosexual and heterosexual and asexual. Like the varieties of sexuality exist. There are lesser and greater based on the capacity to reproduce. So natural law argument is if there are animals in nature that are homosexual, then there will be humans in nature that are also homosexual, right? This is a part of how nature is built. And there will be lesser and greater frames of value based on the capacity to reproduce. That natural law winning out the reproductive groups will win in the long run, is kind of the frame. So this idea, Christians who are gay, those who are only attracted to members of the same sex, and in this frame, they're called to refrain from acting on attraction, to deny themselves, to take up their crosses and follow Christ. And though it may not seem fair to us, kind of the argument of this frame is God's ways are higher than our own, and it's not our role to question, but it's our role to obey. So within this framework, gay people have a problem. And it's that they want to have sex with the wrong people. In this reality, right, because you go back to the Genesis story, God created man and woman, right? That was the construct. And so if God would have wanted anything different than that in the frame of marriage, then God would have created man and man, or woman and man, or woman and woman. Like there would have been more options. So this is a part of where our framing of viewing homosexuals as lustful or sexual beings more so than heterosexuals comes out of some of this teaching in this frame. So straight people get to fall in love, they get to get married, they get to start families, but gay people only get to have sex because marriage is of but a man and a woman. And so what we know is that everyone has sexual orientation. And our sexual orientation isn't just about sex. I mean, I could ask us to raise hands about how many of us in our married life, the vast percentage of our married life has been sexual, but I won't because we don't want to raise our hands for that. Marriage is so much more than sex. So much more than the act of sex. See, but straight people are never really forced to think about their sexual orientation as distinctive in their characteristic. It's still a part of them. It still affects an enormous part of their lives. So what sexual orientation is for a straight person is their capacity to be romantically in love, for self-giving. It's not just about their sexual attraction and their behavior. It's because we have a sexual orientation that we're able to fall in love with somebody, to build long-term relationships, committed relationships with them, and to then form families. See, so family isn't just about sex, but for many of us, it still depends on having a companion and having a spouse, and that is true for gay people as well as straight people. So this is the trap that our gay brothers and sisters have been in, is that when the church looks at them, they're looked at as merely sexual objects. But when we look at the straight side of things, we look at that in this diversity of this is the representation of what it looks like for God in the church. Right? So we see it in a deeper multiplicity, that their sexual identity as a straight person, we see it in a deeper multiplicity than we do with a gay person. Gay person, they're just sexual beings. Now that's a very big oversimplification, but that's part of what happens in the space. We talk about straight people, and our first conversation isn't about who they're sleeping with. But often when the church talks about gay people, the conversation they want to have is who they're in bed with. But we're so much like, our sexual identity is so much more than that. Our gender identity is so much more than that. So gay people have the very same capacity for romantic love and self-giving love that straight people do. And the emotional bond that gay couples share, the quality of love, is the same as the quality of love of straight couples. And gay people, like almost all of us, come from families, and they often want to build families of their own too. So one of the struggles you get into in Christian ethics at a Jesuit school is when you start having these conversations and sex is about being procreative, right? It wasn't until Pope John Paul II that sex actually had a unitive function. The whole function before that in the life of the church in human history was that you could procreate. So if you couldn't procreate from an ethics standpoint, you were living sinfully. So if you were a couple that couldn't produce children, your sex was sinful sex. If you were a senior adult who no longer could produce children because you were past the age of being able to do that, that's sinful sex. Because sex only had a procreative function. It was Pope John Paul, thank God for him, who said, it has more purposes than just the procreative. There's this unitive function, and that is that we feel connected. We find value in life, and there's something that happens in the process of our sexuality that enriches who we are, unless you're gay. So within our frame and how we look at the texts, straight people's sexuality is often seen as a fundamentally good thing, as a gift. And it can be used even in straight people, right? The Bible talks about ways that our sex can be sinful or be used in irresponsible ways. But it can also be harnessed and oriented towards a loving marriage relationship that will be blessed and celebrated within a community. But for gay people, though they're capable of and desire the same type of relationship with the same gender, and it's important for them, their only option within the life of the church is to live celibate lives. You see the problem? Where it becomes a denial of a part of a humanity. And I don't think most people who have this conversation are jumping there intentionally. But if the only kind of relationship that we can frame as good is the one we see in Genesis 1, then everything else that follows is a secondary conversation. Right? All of these things begin to double up on each other post this point of Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve. How many of these conversations start with Adam and Eve? Questions about that before I jump on to Genesis 19?
You mentioned Genesis 1 talking about the homosexual nature as the frame. I'm not getting that in Genesis.
If you heard that, it's not what I meant.
Okay.
What I'm saying is the heterosexual frame is the only frame we see in Genesis 1. And so anything outside of the hetero frame is deviant if we hold that as the primary place, right? It's lesser. It has less value. And so that's been the framing, that's been the starting framing device for how people then enter into a conversation about homosexuality, because the hetero frame is the only frame we can see in that Genesis 1 passage. That make sense? Okay. I saw another hand, but I don't know who it was. Good? Okay. So then that one, so for most people, they don't even put that one in, but I can tell you how many conversations I've had that start there. So I think it's always important to start with, if we hold A, then B and C follow even before you get to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Before you get to chapter 19 and 18, this has already changed your lens. And I'm not gonna do, because I don't have time, and there's going to be later conversations about this. Nathan's going to teach a class for his seminary credit that will be more detailed about gay theory or gay interpretations of the text, because they come at that from a critical critique. They come at the Genesis 1 and they have a critical critique of that. Trans people come at Genesis 1 and have a critical critique of that. And I won't do it justice, so I'm just going to leave it alone in that sense, and we don't have time. So, so then you come to the Genesis 18 and 19 passage, right? We've all heard this story about God destroying cities because of homosexuality, right? Everybody's heard this frame of this? It's one of the kind of proof text places that we do this. But I think it's important on all of these that we relook at the text and ask ourselves the question of, is that really where it's going? Is that really what's being said in the midst of this? So we're going to revisit this ancient story. You can turn, if you want, to Genesis 18 and 19, if you want to open that up in your Bible or on your phone. So if we read and interpret and apply Genesis 18 and 19 as a fly on the wall account of ancient people and ancient stories, that will give us one understanding of this. If we apply this as myth, then we'll ask people who come to the text as myth, ask different questions. Like, what is this trying to teach us? What's the moral narrative happening in this? If we come at it as history, it's going to look back, right? Like, so part of the historical analysis of this text is archaeologists have found what they believe to be Sodom and Gomorrah, and there are city sizes of about 1,000 people, which brings some really interesting construct to Lot as an outsider living in Sodom and meeting people outside the city to bring them in and to keep them safe. Lot would have known everybody in the city of 1,000 people. I grew up in a city of less than 2,000 people, and if I peeled out at the corner, everybody knew it and had told my dad before I got home, right? This was true in the ancient world as well, minus the peeling out. So I'm going to read this to you. You can tell me where this is from. So 2 foreigners arrived late one night to a town whose reputation for wickedness is well known. The foreigners received shelter and provisions at one home in particular, highlighting the stark contrast between the host and the rest of the wicked in the town. And the 2 foreigners revealed to their hospitable hosts that they've come that night on divine mission to destroy the town. However, due to the generous hospitality shown them, the 2 foreigners want to save their hosts, and they urge them to leave the town immediately, not looking back as they go. So when they escape, the family crosses the borders of the town. They glance behind them and witness the utter destruction of the entire city and all the wicked occupants therein. Story sound familiar? It's actually from the Roman poet Ovid in his masterpiece, Metamorphosis. And the two visitors were Zeus and Hermes, who disguised themselves as ordinary peasants to save Bacchus and Philemon. So why do I tell that side of that story? Because the narrative with which we find in Genesis 18 and 19 is not a new narrative, right? It's a narrative that was held within multiple traditions, within multiple cultures, about what does it mean to be hospitable? What does it mean for us to hold hospitality? And so when you go back to this text and you see Lot waiting outside the city to bring these men into their home, you remember the story, they go inside the home, middle of the night, it says all the men from adolescence, doesn't say adolescence, from young to old, come beating on their doors and telling Lot to turn over the two men so we can have sex with them. Now, I was handed a tradition that was homosexuality. Like, this story is about so much homosexuality. This is where we get the idea of a sodomite, right? But in the historical narrative, what you see is Lot says, no, we don't do this. We don't do this to guests in our space. Lot goes outside, risks his own life. Then he says to the people, hey, I'll give you my two virgin daughters. That's good parenting, right? We would recommend that as a historical narrative, right? No, of course we wouldn't. People are okay with that part, right? And they say, no, thank you. Well, if just in a mere historical frame, if you have 1,000 people living in a city, let's say 500 of them are male, of those 500, all of them are not going to be homosexuals. Just not, again, there's a math problem here, just not the way it works. But secondly, what we have is this very deep history of when you are a conqueror and you've won on a battlefield, what was one of the things that happens? You rape the men, not just the women. I can take you to the Museum of Fine Arts and show you painting after painting of battle scenes where men are being raped by the men that are beating them because it was a demasculization of a people of saying that I have power over you. You no longer have your humanity, your identity. You are now something for us to use. Because culturally, you as a man were the only one who had control over who you had sex with, right? Like, it wasn't like women had a lot of choice. They didn't just, like, even the story of Esther, we read that in such a beautiful way. Esther enters in the king's room and she's afraid her head's going to get cut off for even entering the man's room. That's not a healthy relationship, right? He had complete control. Men had complete control. So this is about dominating. This is gang rape. This is what this conversation is about in this, is about power over, and in the culture, like within these other passages where we see like Metamorphosis, what we see is the Hebrew people were called, if you go back into other parts of Deuteronomy, they're called to be hospitable people. Why? Because they were immigrants who didn't have a land. So being different than the places that had not been welcoming to them, they were to be welcoming and hospitable. That was one of the core values of what God was laying into the fabric of who they were. This city was destroyed because it was inhospitable, not because there were a bunch of men who wanted anal sex, a bunch of gay men who wanted anal sex. So again, like, what do we do with this text? Now, does it affirm anal sex in this? No. Right? Again, what questions we bring to the text will change what answers we receive. And so if I'm reading the text for the story it tells, right? Like Greeks even had a term for guest friendship. It was called xenia. What's the opposite of xenia? Xenophobia, right? The opposite of guest friendship. These are the frames with which this text is actually engaging. And so I think part of what we find when we open up these 6 texts is that we find that it's just not as clean as we want it to be. We want a clear answer about homosexuality, but the conversation of the day wasn't about homosexuality as we know it, in any form of which we know it. And that doesn't mean that the Bible can't speak into that, but we can't proof the text to get us there. It's an irresponsible way with which to come at the text. Like, let the text tell us what it's telling us, and then we can ask the text questions. I fully affirm, right, asking the text questions. I fully affirm a Christian sexual ethic. I think there are very clear texts within the Bible that, in fact, I think part of the stuff we're going to jump into in Paul in a minute is actually Paul challenging us with a truly Christian sexual ethic that has to do with mutuality, that has to do with consent, that has to do with monogamy, that I think these are 3 frames, and I could give you more, but that's not the point of this conversation. I think these are 3 frames that we could say the Bible clearly affirms within relationship of what it means to be a sexual human in relationship. Questions about Genesis 18:19? There's a whole lot more there. Again, I'm just trying to dance quick. Because it's already 8 o'clock. What the heck? Okay. So then, Leviticus, there's 2 texts in Leviticus. It's Leviticus, where is it at? Oh man, I had such a pretty picture and I lost it. So it's Leviticus 18 and 22, I think. Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. Now in this, everybody heard the frame abomination, right? That we talk about homosexuality as an abomination. People, if you've ever seen people walking down the street with these signs, homosexuality is abomination. It's a very common frame that we see with anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. These are coming out of what we call the Levitical law, which were written to and for the Levites who maintained they maintained the law, right? They maintained how a community should live and act. And Leviticus is really broken up into 3 sections. The first section is Leviticus 1 through 10, and it's like the sacrificial cult. Then chapters 11 through 17 are ritual pollution and purification. So how do we know when we're unclean and clean? And what does that mean? And then the 18 through 27 are what we refer to as the holiness code. And within that, there are all these frames, like this is an abomination, this is an abomination, this is an abomination, this is an abomination, this is an abomination. These abominations you should die, these abominations you should just be extricated, or now you're unclean, right? So these are the kind of the frames within this text. So I think this is an important point. The law that we receive in the Torah has a purpose. The purpose of that law is not arbitrary. It wasn't law for law's sake, right? This was not, when the Levitical law was handed down, or the 10 Commandments, the Deuteronomical law, any of this, when this was handed down, it wasn't just like, oh, we think people need rules. Let's just create random rules. They had a purpose. And that purpose, I believe, when you read backwards, like we talked about last week, lead to love. They lead to loving God, our neighbor, and ourself better when we live into the law. Now, can the law save us? No, I'm not saying that. Don't hear that not having a conversation about the value or disvalue of the law. I'm just saying that when God handed the law, right, the first set of the commandments are about relationship with God, then it's about relationship with our neighbor in the latter part of the 10 Commandments. Same is true about these laws. It's how do we hold community? How do we navigate what it means to live in a community? And it's not just any community. Israel was God's community that was meant to look different than the communities from which it had come and the communities through which it would pass to where it was going in the promised land. So part of the conversation that they're asking is, coming out of Egypt, who am I and what am I to be now that my value is not on how many bricks I can make in a day? Right? They were coming out of slavery. And God is handing them frames. God is handing them frames saying, I want you to be different than those that you've come out of. I want you to be set apart when the people look at you. And so they create these frames. In chapter 18, the primary focus is about violations against the family. So if you read through that chapter, what you hear is, you shouldn't have sex with your aunts, you shouldn't have sex with your uncles, or your siblings, or your mothers, or your stepmothers. You name it, it's off limits. Don't do it. It's not good for a community. Then you get to verse 21, and it takes a detour. It prohibits sacrificing your child to Molech, who was the god of the Canaanite people. And then you arrive at verse 22, where it says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It's an abomination. And then verse 23 wraps it all up with, don't do bestiality, right? So that's the frame of that. I'm going to leave that alone for a minute. I'll jump back. So then what's an abomination? I think there's three important things to recognize about abomination. The word is tova. Tova was three things. Number one, it was relative in nature. So it implies violations of cultural divisions. So what I mean by that is there were abominations were things that caused cultural boundaries to disappear. So an example of this are being a shepherd, eating with Hebrew people, the sacrifices to God from the Hebrew people. These were all things that Egyptians called tova, right? They were things that were cultural breaks from the culture of Egypt. It's also important to know that tova is not always synonymous with sinful. There are other words in the Hebrew that clearly mean sinful in the way that we understand sinful, that this word is not used in this way in this passage. Now, it can also be sinful. It can do both. So if an act was identified as tova, it did not automatically mean that the act in question was inherently inherently objectable, yeah. Eternally or immorally offensive. It was a cultural frame. Third, it was used to describe the improper mixing of substances or transgressing of boundaries. So what you see just before this are things like you shouldn't mix fibers, right? That's an abomination. It's an abomination to mix clothing fibers. It's an abomination Like, I mean, they list a ton of things as abominations that are about mixing of things. Because it was about purity, right? There's a purity side of this. So part of what is happening in this is a maintaining of family frames, a maintaining of what is proper sexual etiquette within the culture. Again, this was not about men marrying men and having monogamous relationships with them, because that was not an option. It wasn't a thing that this is trying to answer. This is saying that a man should not lie with a man like he lies with a woman, because part of that is like denouncing your manhood in that culture. In the same way that in Gomorrah and Sodom, if you're raped, your value is shifted within the culture. That's also true within the Hebrew culture at this space. So we want it to be something, and it has value, but it may not be the thing that we want it to mean and to understand it as. So these are the 3 Old Testament passages, and then you have 3 New Testament passages. The first one comes in Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. And here Paul begins this letter in Romans 1 through 3 by describing the unrighteousness of all humanity. Jew and Gentile alike, and their universal need for a Savior. Romans 3 nears its close with the famous verse, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In Romans 3:10, Paul says, there is no one righteous, not even one. And he's building, right? This is a kind of theological case. He's arguing in chapter 2 that even though the Jews have the law, they still don't follow it well enough to earn their salvation. And then he starts chapter 1 by describing the unrighteousness of humanity more broadly. And in Romans 1, 18 through 32, Paul writes of the descent of the Gentiles into idolatry and the consequences for them for their rejection of God. And he says that they knew the truth about God, but they rejected it. And they exchanged their truth for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things instead of the Creator. And so because of that, God let them go, right? They chose somebody other than God, and God said, okay, do what you will. And he let them live without God, and he gave them over into their vices and their passions. Now, what do we know about Roman culture? We know lots about Roman culture. They like to party, especially the men. And on every street corner, there was a temple, and you did a few things at the temple. You ate well, you drank well, and you slept well, minus the sleeping, if you were a man. Right? This was a part of the reality of that day. And like this text in Leviticus, Paul is saying that being a person of faith needs to look differently than what you're seeing all around you. Now, there's a word that Paul uses regularly. It's a word called porneia. And he makes these lists of porneia. You might notice the word. It sounds very similar to porn, because that's where our word comes from. It's the etymology. And it means usury, sexual usury. So he'll create these frames of sexual usury. And he makes these lists of what sexual usury is and what it implies and how that lives into. So in verses 26, 27, he says, because of this, referring to their idol worship, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even the women exchanged natural sexual relations with unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women who were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with another man and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, in the early 80s, this was the passage frequently used for why gay people got HIV. Talk about weaponizing a text. Clearly not talking about HIV. And it's being weaponized. Why it's okay that gay people are dying. Why we shouldn't have to be concerned or worry. It's due penalty, assigned to them by God. So in the ancient world, homosexuality was widely considered not to be different sexual orientation or something inherently that was a part of who people were, right? Like, people didn't consider sexual identity that much. Like, were there people who were, who, why am I word side up? Were there men who liked men? Yes, that's been true. Frequently, they were temple prostitutes. Often, one of the passages that Nathan will preach on next time he preaches, he's going to talk about the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Often, we know historically that people who didn't like women were put in charge of the harem because then you didn't have to worry about your harem. And that wasn't just people who were eunuchs, were not always castrated people. Sometimes there were people who just didn't care about your women. So it's safe. They can be over the women. Not interested. So in the midst of this, right, like part of what we see from other well-known first century Greek philosophers like Dio Chrysostom wrote that a man whose appetite is insatiate in such things, referring to heterosexual relationships, will have contempt for easy conquest and scorn for a woman's love as a thing too readily given, and will turn his assault against male quarters, believing that in them he will find the kind of pleasure difficult and hard to procure. Right? So this 4th century Christian writer is saying that you will see that all such desire stems from greed and will not remain in its usual bounds. So part of what happens as men turn themselves over to porneia, lustfulness of usury, is they use everything and everyone. I studied theater for a long time. I did this whole theater paper about the Greek culture where, as a Greek man, you could literally have sex with anyone or anything except a boy who was going to be of the same class as you. Right? Those were the only ones who were safe from your realities of usury. This is what Paul's talking about. Now, does Paul have any idea that in 2,000 years, men are going to be okay with marrying men? No, he doesn't. And I don't think he's saying that's okay. So don't hear me say that I think Paul's saying, yep, I think that's fine. I just don't think Paul even has an idea it's real. I don't think it's a conversation that I think we're bringing questions to Paul that Paul would say, what? You can do that? I just don't think it's the same conversation. So I think then using it to proof text, to weaponize, to do these sorts of things, first off, you're using a text for that's not what Paul's talking about. And when he gets to the point of Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10, where the word homosexuality we find in our translation, first off, you only find it post 1946. But beyond that, those two words that we come to in that text, malakoi and arsyntakoitai, however you say that, these three words don't mean the things that we translate them to be. Malakoi means soft, right? It's talking about people in the time, and that one comes in the 1 Corinthians passage. It uses malakoi and arsyntakoitai, uses both of these frames, and it talks about the soft ones. Don't be soft. Don't be used as an object of somebody else. Well, okay. I mean, truthfully, in the 1st century, I would have probably been soft. It's a part of the reality of how we understand self and how they understood self and the Greek realities of what it meant to be man and to be strong and valued in this place. And then you get to this arsyntakoitai frame, and it is meaning don't, the two words put together are, like the best frame would be like, So let me say this first off. The word doesn't exist until Paul uses it in any part of literature. Like you don't see it. So scholars either believe that Paul created this word by merging two words to talk about what he was seeing in the cultures of the day, but it never used again in the text other than in this Timothy passage, and that's it. So it's basically like a woman's bed. Don't be used as a woman. Well, and is that what we're talking about when we talk about homosexuality? No, not in my experience of gay men and women who are talking about living faithful lives, following the way of Jesus in committed relationships with other people of the same sex. It's not a usury. They're not using each other. It's mutuality. Paul is denouncing usury in all forms. So one thing I can say very clearly about the sexual ethic that Paul is talking about in this place is at any moment that you are using someone else for your own benefit, that's sinful. Including your spouse, by the way. But he's not talking about this other thing that we want him to be talking about. Because it just didn't exist in the same way that it exists. So do these scriptures tell us something? Yeah. Are they important to engage in this? Of course. Are they a part of the overarching conversation with how we as the church deal with gender and sexuality? I think they should be. I just don't think we should make them into being the thing that we've made them into being. And now, all of these books are going to go in much more depth of these words and parsing these words. And there's, thousands upon thousands of books like this of straight people, right? So if you don't even want to listen to gay people, which I would highly recommend that you do, but if you don't want to listen to gay people, there are brilliant straight theologians who are conservative, who still say, you're doing something in the text that isn't there. So then what do we do? What do we do in these questions of gender and transgender and body dysmorphia and mutual loving married relationships and pastors who are gay and what do we do with it? Because we're not gonna, I wish I had my Bible here. Hold it up. I'll hold my phone because my Bible's in my phone. I think you can find within this how we should behave, like pointers for us of what we should do and where we should go and what should be next, but it's not just gonna tell us, right? It's not, like we talked about the first week, it's not this roadmap that's gonna give you every direction of how you should behave as a society in this reality. But it will point us in directions of what it means to follow in the way of Jesus. But there's going to be some questions we throw at the Bible that it's not going to have answers for because they weren't their questions. And so what do we do in places where we're asking the text questions that weren't their questions? That's non-rhetorical. I'm really asking, what do we do? So first we have to realize it, right? First it is important to say out loud that this thing isn't saying what we think it's saying, which the church has not been good at historically since this has become the issue that we want to talk about all the time. It hasn't been good about saying this doesn't really say what we wanted to say, and we don't have the answers. That is a part of that. That is a hermeneutical lens. There are those that would say, I'm not theying them. There are those who would say that it says more than I want to say it says. But yes, that is a hermeneutical lens.
I'll tell you how I handled it. As many know, Jack Mamie and I are very good friends.
Mm-hmm.
Many of you don't know is I have a gay son.
Mm.
And I had a hell of a time with that. And one time Jack said, well, how did you manage that? Because we had conversations. I must say he's not as well informed as you are. But I said, well, Jack, I just took a look at Vegas and I tore those sections out. And then the next thing I said, I tore the whole damn book out. And finally I just took the whole New Testament out, and that's what I've got left.
Yeah.
I said, not a bad idea.
So if you didn't hear that, Jerry said he has a gay son, and Jack Nemi asked him how did he come to terms with that? And how did he manage it? And he said, well, I started with Leviticus and I tore it out. And then I went to the next section, I tore it out, and then I had left was the New Testament. And Jack said, that's a good idea. I won't go that far. I think that's brilliant. And I think that I think these passages of Leviticus actually say a lot to us about, I do think God wants us to be a community that's different than the community of the world. Now, I don't think that the rules that were set up for the Hebrew community in the whatever BC are going to be useful, all of them, for us today. I like my polyester. I like mixed fiber clothing. I think it's great. I like sitting on the bed that my wife and I sleep on after she's had a period without being unclean for 7 days. I actually don't mind having sex with my wife after she's been in a menstrual cycle. I don't feel like I'm unclean and messy for that, right? I like pork. I like shrimp. I like, all of these rules that are there, they're not the same rules that apply for us. And I think part of what we have to ask is the challenge of the Levitical community is okay, but what are the things that we're going to hold to as a community that show us to set apart? That show us that we're different. For me, it's definitely not that we don't accept people who have a gay orientation. I want there to be people who are different than me in their sexual orientation and gender and identity, because when I meet them, I meet a part of God that I've not met yet. And a new reality. So one of my favorite professors used to say, the moment that we separated committed gay couples from the church, we lost a part of what it means to be in love from the kingdom of God that we can no longer learn from. There are gifts that our gay brothers and sisters bring to us that without them at the table, we don't have. And so I don't want to exclude that. I don't believe that's the healthy way. But what is? What are the rules of community? I think those things do matter.
Well, and if it was such a big deal, wouldn't it have made the top 10?
Right.
It didn't make it.
Yeah.
There's only one message of Jesus. And the last I checked, nobody's ranking sin. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You get to the pearly gates and they say, oh, well, I ate my pork and I ate my shrimp. I raped a kid. But can I get in because at least I'm not gay?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? There's no ranking. No one said this sin was worse than this other thing.
Right. And so that's a really beautiful statement. Part of what Melanie is saying is that when we get to heaven, there's no ranking of sin. It's not oh, at least I'm not gay, so I'm in, right? It's but one of the constructs here, right, that this is the construct, and I want to go like this over here, because this construct is naming that being gay is sinful, and I actually don't think it is sinful. I think it's an identity. I think it's a part of who you are in your space. And so I think part of what the church has said historically, by historically I mean in the last 30 years, is love the sinner, hate the sin. But that statement to a person who is LGBTQ is saying, you don't love me, because in the same way that it'd be like me saying, well, love the heterosexual, but hate their heterosexual identity, right? You can't separate the two. We want to separate the two for gay people and not separate it for hetero people. If you separate one, you have to separate both in order to not create an ethical fallacy of how you're treating people, right? So for me, the space that I stand in, and this is my bias, is it's not simple. It's part of their identity, and God loves them just as they are. God created them that way, and there's value that they bring to the church and the world that we need to embrace and learn and engage and encounter. And the Bible's not talking about that because it wasn't his questions of the day. In the same way that many of the things that women bring to the text, it's not talking about. And women have a right to say to the text, I think this is BS. I think the way that we see God treat Hagar as opposed to Sarah is messy. And I don't know what to do with that part of the Bible. And I think parts where God calls for genocide, I don't know what to do with that. I don't think it's God, and I think it's wrong. I don't think God's asking for that. And so I state that I disagree with this part of the text. I don't think that's God. I think that's a misread of what God is doing in the world. And the text creates it. That's how I've done the dance, right? Like you. There's certain parts where I'm like, yeah, me, yeah. And every time I do that, I try to go deeper, right? Like part of why, I'll be really honest, part of why I preached on Daniel is because generally I haven't liked the book of Daniel. So sometimes I preach on the things that I don't like so that I can get deeper in and try to understand new things that I haven't understood before. That's a part of what it means to be a faithful Christian, is that we go deeper in the places that we don't understand, that we don't just take a text and say, okay, this word and this word equals this, malakoi, arsenio koitai, like that they just mean homosexuality, even though the word homosexuality didn't even exist until the middle of the 19th century. Like it's an unjust read.
I guess I think the media portrayal of what it means to be gay has been so anti-establishment. It's created a fear culture of these are people who are against family. These are people who are against, everything that, quote, the traditional church, or many things the traditional church has. And unfortunately, that's the portrayal that's been presented so much.
Yeah.
And latched onto, that it's created this culture of fear, just like the culture of fear of immigrants or other groups of people, because they appear different and predatory, and these groups you need to be afraid of.
I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's so. If you didn't hear what he said, that the media portrayal of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, that part of that has been that there's this deviance and there's this thing that is, they're not for family, they're anti-family, they're anti these things, and they're pushing against our establishment in some ways. And so it's created a culture of fear and a culture of like rebuttal response from us, trying to save the family as a frame. And that's been the thing that we've been handed. And so part of the healing of that is changing the narrative of how we understand and know LGBTQ people in the midst of that reality. I think that's really helpful. Others? So again, like my point in this is not to tell you that you're wrong. My point is to tell you that it doesn't say what we want it to say, what we may have been told that it says. And so then we got to do some work. So an example of this is, and I'm going to jump out of the LGBTQ section for a second. I had a huge group of young adults at my church in Minneapolis, and all of them lived with somebody, meaning a partner. They weren't married. They're between 25 and 35. And we did pub theology every Wednesday night, and we would go drink and talk theology and do this sort of thing, and it was beautiful. And so we struck up at one point this conversation of what does it mean to have a sexual ethic, loving people the way that God loves us, and bringing our sexuality into the conversation. And you would have thought with these young adults that I was crazy, right? It took us 2.5 months to get like 6 words that we would agree to that are faithful and following in the way of Jesus. Words like mutuality, words like respect, words like love, words like commitment, words like monogamy, these sorts of frames that we just kept parsing through, like, well, what does it mean to follow in the way of Jesus in our sexual lives? What does it look like? Like, that's a part of who we are. Our sexuality is part of who we are. What does it look like to follow Jesus in our sex? And what words were falling by the wayside? So this isn't like, the church isn't having this conversation. And I think it actually is maybe the more beneficial conversation. We keep wanting to talk about what's taboo, what we can say no to instead of what we can say yes to. And we keep being known as a no people instead of a yes people. And I think that's part of our work to do as people of faith. I think if we don't know gay people, that one of the challenges should be in our life that you should go and not just have a drink with a gay person, but literally sit down and get to know them, invite them into your home, engage, be connected in that. Talk to a gay dad, a dad of a gay son. Jerry, sorry about that. I know you're a gay mom right here. You would be shocked by how many people in our church have gay family. I would say the 250 that I sit down and talked with for coffees, probably somewhere around 75 people within that frame had a familial connection with a person who was gay. And it was part of why they're at St. Matthew, right? Is that this is a place where they feel like they can bring their gay kid and their gay cousin and their gay aunt and their gay, it's a part of how this church even understands itself before I even knew that it understood itself in that way. So it's, these conversations are important conversations to have. There's quite, I have a whole nother set of books on transgender that I haven't read yet, so I didn't bring them tonight because I don't usually ask people to read books that I haven't read. And it's a whole new world that's opening up for me now that we have a transgender bishop. I've done very little work. I've been an LGBTQ advocate for 20 plus years, and I'll be honest, I've not done much work in transgender realities, so I don't know a lot. That I think we have a lot to learn. And what that means and how we engage. And it's a whole separate conversation of how a transgender person reads the text versus how a gay person reads the text versus how a lesbian person reads the text, right? It's just different. Any other questions, any thoughts that you have that you want to share in this moment? So I want to say this. Yeah.
And I'm hearing you say that, and how important it is to look to what we do as so as to not sow division and to be divisive, and rather look to Scripture and look to what we're doing to how we can unify and all be God's children. Your talk tonight is just extremely enlightening and really helpful. And the frames that you put up on the screen would be wonderful if that could be reproduced, because there's a lot of lists in there that are deserving of some deeper thought and acting out.
Yeah, I'll send them to our group. So if you didn't hear what Jim said for him, the biggest piece of this that has stood out is this idea of bias, and that we all come to bias, we all have a bias, we come to the text with a bias, and discerning and figuring out our bias really matters. And that's a starting point to get us to a deeper sense of connectivity, and instead of conflict, to get us to connection. And I totally affirm that. I think one of the first roles of a person of faith is to name and begin to understand the bias they bring to the conversations, to the church and the text. And to accept other people's perception that I can accept it and disagree with you, right? Disagreement's healthy, and that's part of the goodness of this. I think another piece that I want to connect, to just jump off what you just said, is that when I was given the Bible as a kid, I was told to read it like a constitution, And I think in my older days, what I've come to read it as, instead of a constitution, is as a conversation. And so I'm having a conversation with this text instead of it being these rules in which I follow that set up the more perfect union. That this is a conversation that God's having with me still today and with our people and our community and this community in relationship to the communities that come before us.
There's a thought in the constitutional law that the Constitution is a living, breathing
Right.
instrument,
Yep.
as opposed to a rock that's somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. The Constitution itself is a living document. Yeah.
That's why they call it the living Bible, too.
Yep. Yep. The living Bible, absolutely. So I'm going to let you go. Go in peace and love people more. Thanks. Thank you.